In Hollywood, a dead man isn't who he appears to be, and someone just walked away with $1 million insurance benefit. Now, forensics must prove that murder was part of the package. A police officer kills his wife in a freak car accident, but investigators believe he may have been driven to homicide. A simple farmer stands accused of murdering his brother, and a town rallies to his defense. So does forensic science. They look death in the face every day of their lives. From fragments of bone, drops of blood, and slivers of tissue, they can piece together the shattered circumstances that bring the deceased to their labs. Every body has a story to tell, and each is a page in the coroner's casebook. When someone dies, their work begins. Coroners, medical examiners, and criminalists know that every kind of death leaves its subtle mark. And they know murder when they see it. Early in the morning of April 16, 1988, the Glendale, California 911 dispatcher received a call about a man in cardiac arrest. The call was placed by Dr. Richard Boggs, a respected neurologist. When paramedics arrived at his office, he explained that the man was one of his patients named Gene Hansen, who had a history of heart trouble. The victim had credit cards in Hansen's name. Before he called 911, Dr. Boggs said he'd done all he could to revive his patient, but nothing worked. Gene Hansen was declared dead at the scene. At the LA County Coroner's Office, the body was given a routine autopsy. The office sees 200 bodies each day, and this one was just another face in the crowd. Seeing no immediate cause of death except for a few marks on the heart, the coroner deferred to the diagnosis of the victim's personal physician, Dr. Boggs. Hansen's cause of death was listed as heart failure due to a dangerous heart condition. The body was released to the hands of John Hawkins, Hansen's companion and his partner in their successful sportswear business. He flew to California from Ohio to claim the remains. He had them cremated in respect for Hansen's last request. Hawkins, as his partner's sole beneficiary, then received the first million of Hansen's $1.5 million life insurance policy. Usually, that would be the end of the story. But this story was just getting started. 5 months after the death, an insurance agent was closing Hansen's file when she noticed something strange. The face on Hansen's autopsy photo didn't resemble the photo supplied by the Department of Motor Vehicles. To double check, she requested that the thumbprint on file at the DMV be compared with the one from the autopsy. No doubt about it. These were two different men. And that raised two vital questions. Where was the real Hansen, and who was the dead man? The agent had uncovered something a lot more serious than insurance fraud. Though they're situated next to each other, the difference between Glendale, California and North Hollywood is like night and day. But this is where Glendale police went to solve the mystery of the dead man who wasn't Gene Hansen. Police determined from fingerprints and missing persons reports that the man was really a bookkeeper named Ellis Green. He was last seen leaving a bar in North Hollywood on April 15th. The next day, he was declared dead under an assumed name in Dr. Boggs's office. Sergeant John Perkins of the Glendale Police tried to sort out what happened.
A photograph of Ellis Green's body that was depicted in the doctor's office was taken to his elderly aunt, and that photo was shown to her. She identified that as being Ellis Green, her nephew. Now we knew we had the real body, the real name, but we still didn't have an exact or approximate cause of death.
Demonstrating how Green died was only half the task before him. Investigators also had to prove that the real Gene Hansen was still alive. By now, months had passed. If Hansen were alive, he had an enormous head start to find a hiding place. John Hawkins, his partner in this elaborate insurance scam, had also vanished, along with $1 million of insurance money.
Michael Bodden, John Perkins.
Police concentrated on the last person to see the victim alive, Dr. Boggs.
Hello, officers. I'm Dr. Boggs. What can I do for you?
Police paid a visit to him to find out about the man who died in his office. Boggs told them that he'd been a patient for years. Boggs knew him only as Melvin Eugene Hansen, or Gene. He had no reason to suspect it was an assumed name. Faced with a search warrant, he handed over his patient's files. Sergeant Perkins examined them. It was possible that Dr. Boggs was telling the truth. Gene Hansen's records showed that he'd been repeatedly warned about his condition, but refused to follow doctor's orders. But it was also possible that Dr. Boggs was in on this elaborate insurance scam, and the records themselves were doctored. Perkins pulled 3 EKG strips, dated several months apart. He wondered if they truly demonstrated the life-threatening heart condition that supposedly killed Green. He asked a cardiologist to analyze the EKGs. The heart specialist told him that they indicated a mild, common condition that wasn't fatal. Perkins was more suspicious than ever that Dr. Boggs had intentionally faked the records. But he couldn't prove it. Then he found the answer was right on the EKG strips. Simple enough for even a layman to understand.
Late one night, I was sitting at my desk and I'm looking at these EKG strips and I'm going through them and I'm looking at them and suddenly it became very obvious. One was completely clean. One had a red dye halfway down the length of the EKG strip, and the other one had a complete dye from the entire length of the EKG strip. And you suddenly think, wait a minute, these are all connected. So I put them up on the desk and put them end to end, and sure enough, the fractures matched perfectly.
The red markings, signaling the end of the roll, formed one continuous darkening line across 2 of the 3 strips, allowing Perkins to put them into sequential order. But when he did so, the dates that Boggs wrote on the back of the strips were out of order and months apart.
These were fabricated EKG strips.
While Perkins was making his discovery, the case was progressing on a different front.
You want to check this area in here, and I'll go in the kitchen and check. Okay.
Police were following the trail of Ellis Green's credit card purchases. The dead man's cards were still active and still in use. Investigators weren't sure who was using them, but they hoped it was the real Gene Hansen. They tracked the card to a bungalow on Key West, Florida. The rental agent confirmed that the tenant was a man named Ellis Green. He had moved out weeks earlier, and the apartment hadn't been rented since. Detectives looked for any clues that could reveal the identity of the former occupant. On a glass in a cabinet, they found one, a fingerprint. It matched Gene Hansen's. Now they had proof that he was alive.
Sir, could you have a seat there,
Then, in January 1989, 9 months after his reported death, Gene Hansen, traveling under another assumed name, was stopped at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport returning from Mexico. He'd been acting eccentrically enough for customs agents to pull him over and inspect his suitcases. They found $14,000 in cash that he failed to declare, thereby breaking the law. They also found the IDs for 13 people. Among them was Ellis Green's, the dead man in Dr. Boggs's office. Here was proof that he'd switched identities with the victim and pocketed some of his own death benefits. He was arrested. With Gene Hansen captured and the incriminating EKG strips, police had enough to arrest Boggs as well. They knew they had him for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. In fact, they uncovered evidence that he and Hansen had pulled off some fraudulent claims in the past. The two of them, along with John Hawkins, staged car accidents for the insurance money. Dr. Boggs was the physician who signed off on their medical claims. But was there enough evidence to prove that Boggs actually murdered Ellis Green as part of the conspiracy? Without a body, they didn't seem to have much of a case. Boggs claimed that they originally hoped to steal a body from the morgue, but that proved impossible. Then, by gruesome coincidence, the conspirators said they happened upon Ellis Green's body shortly after he died. Despite how unlikely the story sounded, Boggs challenged the prosecution to prove he was lying. Glendale Police Sergeant John Perkins had to somehow turn an elaborate insurance scam into a case of homicide. Gene Hansen, the man who faked his own death, and Richard Boggs, the accommodating physician, were already in custody. Perkins was eager to put all the pieces together and wrap it up, but there was still no sign of John Hawkins, the beneficiary who fled with the $1 million insurance payout. And still, investigators were short on evidence to prove what they strongly suspected, that Dr. Boggs murdered Ellis Green to pass him off as Gene Hansen.
We really needed somebody who could look at the entire pieces of evidence that we had, that being the autopsy report, some of the tissues. There was a stomach content that was collected at the time of autopsy, and examine those from an independent view, to look at the crime scene photos, to give us some indication as to this person did not die of natural causes. And that's when we brought in Dr. Michael Bodden.
Michael Bodden is the executive director of the New York State Police Forensic Science Unit. He's also an expert on the nuances that death leaves on the body. He has worked on the congressional committees that investigated the deaths of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. In the case of Ellis Green, Bodden had slides of his heart, lung, and liver tissue, as well as photographs of the victim that were taken shortly after death. From this evidence, Bodden could determine two facts with confidence. One, Green did not have a fatal heart condition, and two, his skin, which showed no other marks, was blue at the time of death, suggesting lack of oxygen. From these two facts, Bodden reached a single conclusion: Green was suffocated. Except for the telltale blue color, In the absence of a struggle, suffocation leaves no marks. Its diagnosis comes from eliminating all other possible causes of death. It's a diagnosis of exclusion.
A bullet wound, we don't need a diagnosis of exclusion because we find a hole in the body. A stab wound or a blow from a baseball bat all leave marks on the body that we can see at autopsy. But if something is put over the nose and mouth, causing a person to die because he or she can't breathe, and then that object is removed, a hand or a pillow, at the autopsy there's no specific finding that's going to say that he was suffocated.
The evidence was enough to convince a jury that the three men had planned the crime together, and that Dr. Boggs, the healer, was Dr. Boggs, a killer.
These three individuals were not strangers to crime. They had hooked up probably 4 years before this particular murder, and they had worked out different ways of committing insurance fraud. And the plan that they evolved was somebody had to die. That person, they agreed, was to be Gene Hansen. And the only way that they could pull this thing off was with a doctor, and that doctor was Dr. Boggs.
Police believe that Boggs picked Ellis Green up at a bar, the last place he had been seen. He bought him some drinks to make him more compliant. The victim's blood alcohol content was well above the legal limit. Then, Boggs lured him to his office. Just in case the victim was still sober enough to fight back, Boggs may have incapacitated him with a stun gun. Then the victim was smothered without putting up a fight. Perkins believes that the forensic pathologist's determination of murder made this case winnable.
Dr. Bodden's testimony in this particular case, I feel, was that last inning, you're down by 2 and bases are loaded, and Dr. Bodden came in and basically hit a home run for us.
In 1990, Richard Boggs was found guilty of first-degree murder and fraud. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. It took 3 years and a worldwide manhunt before police caught up with John Hawkins on the island of Sardinia. In 1995, both he and Melvin Eugene Hansen were convicted of fraud, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Hansen was given life without parole. Hawkins received 25 years to life. The work of the medical examiner undermined the murderous conspiracy of Gene Hansen and his cohorts. But whether a crime is ingenious or devilishly simple, the forensics required to solve it is equally complex. On the rainy night of November 27, 1992, just after 9:30 p.m., a passing motorist reported what looked like an accident on Hawaii's Volcano Highway. Police arrived to find a van facing the wrong way, apparently after spinning. The responding officer recognized the owner of the van to be Ken Matheson, a sergeant on the police force. Ken was badly shaken up. His wife, Yvonne, fared much worse. Ken had tended to her in the back of the van until help arrived. She had lost a lot of blood. By strange coincidence, Yvonne Matheson was a nurse who helped deliver the responding officer's first child weeks before. Paramedics moved her into the ambulance to rush her to the hospital at Hilo. The hospital where she worked became the place where she died. When Ken Matheson's fellow officers heard about the incident on the police radio, they went to see him at the hospital. Matheson told one of his colleagues that his wife's death was a terrible accident. She was driving the van when they started to fight. Things escalated. Enraged beyond reason, Ivan jumped out of the open window of the moving van. Ken said he slid over to steer the vehicle, then backed up to look for his wife. That's when he ran over her. Ivan and Ken Matheson had once been divorced, but then decided to give their marriage a second chance. It seemed to be working this time, give or take the usual rough spots. Then this tragedy destroyed it all. According to Hilo police, any accident that results in death is considered negligent homicide. For this misdemeanor, Matheson could expect a maximum fine of $1,000 and a year in jail. At the least, he'd be fined $100 or be sentenced to 100 hours of community service.
Don't worry.
In any case, he'd be able to keep his badge. He didn't protest the charges. As in any sudden death, a complete investigation would have to be conducted. It was a formality. The death of Ivan Matheson was unfortunate and tragic, but police had no reason to doubt Ken's story. While the investigation was underway, Matheson stayed on active duty with the police force. But after inspecting the scene of the accident, Hawaii County Police noticed some minor inconsistencies between the roadside evidence and Matheson's story. At first, they seemed hardly worth mentioning. Each year, tourists flock to Hawaii to escape the cares of their daily lives. The sun, the surf, and the primal fiery beauty of the volcanoes exert their cleansing influence. For Hawaii's inhabitants, life in paradise goes on just like anywhere else. Crimes are committed, accidents happen, and investigators are charged with determining which is which. In Hilo, traffic investigators inspected the area where the wife of Sergeant Ken Matheson lost her life. They found relatively little blood on the highway compared to what was found in the van. Though it was a little peculiar, they wrote it off to the rain and the fact that Ken Matheson had rushed his dying wife into the van after he struck her. At the police impoundment lot, the van had its own story to tell. It was routine procedure for a vehicle involved in a fatal accident to undergo a mechanical inspection. It negates any future defense claims of faulty equipment. Police also had to be sure the van was safe to drive before they could release it to Matheson. Because of the nature of this accident, the undercarriage was thoroughly inspected. Hawaii County Police traffic investigator Martin Elazar was surprised by the relative lack of damage he found there. However, when he was done inspecting the outside, the interior of the van caught his interest.
I peered inside from the outside and I could see blood stains. Blood stains on the driver's side window, blood stains on the plastic cover to the panel area fronting the steering wheel. Blood stains up above there. There's a heavy concentration of blood and hair on that bolt.
There was no reason for blood to be in the driver's portion of the vehicle. Elazar needed a closer look. But to search inside the van required a warrant. he asked Deputy Attorney General Kurt Spohn to request one. The warrant came through in the nick of time. 3 months had passed since the incident. According to Spohn, their main piece of evidence almost slipped through their fingers.
You do a mechanical inspection, and once all the mechanical inspections and the search warrants are finished, you return the van to the owner. And in this case, the van was authorized to be returned to the owner.
Fortunately, Matheson hadn't picked it up yet. The van was secure. The release authorization was canceled. A search warrant for the van's interior was issued. Now, Spohn had to face the dismal possibility that Sergeant Matheson's story might be a lie. And though they still had the van, another piece of vital evidence was lost forever.
We decided that this case was possibly more than a negligent homicide, and because of that, we decided we should probably have a forensic pathologist do an autopsy in this case. However, at that time, we found out that the body had been cremated.
Yvonne Matheson's body had been autopsied 3 days after her death. On the island of Hawaii, the coroner is also the chief of police. A pathologist from a nearby hospital is retained as a consultant. The pathologist was told that the death was accidental. But a pathologist specializes in natural causes of death, such as disease. Even so, he could tell that the victim's injuries didn't jibe with Ken Matheson's account. The pathologist noted injuries to the victim's head, arms, and hands that weren't consistent with being run over or tumbling out of the vehicle. But the interpretation of these injuries lay outside the scope of the consulting pathologist's training. It was really a job for a forensic pathologist who specializes in death by unnatural causes. Still, puzzled by his findings, the pathologist was sure to photograph every aspect of the victim and to take tissue samples. Now that the victim had been cremated, they were all that was left. A tragic accident case was now turning ugly. Spohn knew there was enough cause to open a homicide investigation, but without a body, there might not be enough evidence to resolve it. The original pathologist's photos and the evidence from the van would have to be enough. He braced himself for the inevitable public outcry.
In some ways, it's kind of a no-win situation. If you investigate and find out that the police officer is innocent and you announce that, everybody says, well, it's swept under the rug because this is a police officer. And if you investigate the case and you find out that the officer is guilty and you charge him, everybody says you're only charging him because you're buckling under to public pressure and he's actually innocent.
Sure enough, 6 months into the investigation, widespread criticism forced Sergeant Ken Matheson's superiors to put him on desk duty while he remained a suspect. The press coverage brought to light an intriguing incident. A witness who read about the case in the papers told investigators that on the night of the accident, he stopped to help shortly after 9 p.m. As he pulled over, a man, possibly Ken Matheson, stepped from the back of the van and shined a flashlight in his eyes. He told the Samaritan that no one was injured and that the police had already been called. Then he sent him away. Investigators now suspected that perhaps the passerby interrupted the crime in progress. They just had to prove it.
Martin, one of the interesting things about...
In Hawaii, Deputy Attorney General Kurt Spohn faced the unhappy task of investigating Sergeant Ken Matheson for murder. To find out more about the blood spatter in the driver's area of Matheson's van, he asked a colleague to locate the best blood spatter expert in the country.
Approximately a 28-mile drive. A couple of days later, he told me that it was someone by the name of Dr. Henry Lee, who was the head of the Connecticut State Forensics Laboratory.
Henry Lee, who is now commissioner of the state's Department of Public Safety, uses the laws of physics to uphold the laws of justice. His expertise is reading clues written in blood.
That's called medium velocity.
He's not afraid to get his hands dirty in the process. Like any substance, blood is affected by gravity and momentum. Every kind of bloodshed leaves behind characteristic clues. Stabbing will create a dripping pattern. The relatively low velocity of the weapon doesn't propel blood too far from the source. A speeding bullet, on the other hand, creates a bloody mist. And a bludgeoning wound produces large spatters that can spray far. By examining the tiny tails behind each drop of blood, Lee can determine the position of the victim and the amount of force used to create the injury. From this, and from the size of the wound, he can determine the type of weapon used and deduce the circumstances of a person's death. Lee is perhaps most famous for his work on the O.J. Simpson trial. He's also helped identify victims in mass graves in Bosnia.
She was in fact.
As soon as Lee received the photos taken from the Matheson case, he pored over them and became suspicious. He felt he was definitely looking at a crime scene.
After I received the photograph, did the detailed examination, my initial reaction, something is wrong with this case. Some foul play took place inside the van.
From the photographs of the driver's side window, Lee could tell that the blood at the front of the van was spattered at medium velocity, suggesting blunt force trauma. It appeared the victim was struck multiple times. The blood stains on the window also contradicted Matheson's assertion that his wife dived out of it.
At the time of incident, this window was up. Approximately 200 medium velocity blood spatter was noticed in this area alone.
Lee needed to see the van firsthand to trace the trajectory of the spatter. Strings were connected to each droplet to determine their common point of origin. It turned out to be the driver's seat area, about the height where a person's head would be. Lee's findings showed the damage was inflicted before she left the vehicle. The photos from the autopsy showed that the victim's head had sustained enough damage to kill her. Once Dr. Lee determined that a struggle had occurred in the van, investigators knew that Ken Matheson was lying. His motive for killing his wife was probably money.
If she died in an accident, he would be paid $595,000, and if she died in an automobile-related accident, he would be paid $675,000.
Sir, step out of the car. Put your hands up. Keep your hands where I can see them. Face down on the ground. Come on, over here in the ground. Face down. Move it. Face down.
Based on the evidence, Ken Matheson was arrested on his day off. Police pieced together the murder. While Yvonne was driving, Ken Matheson struck her with a blunt object. She probably stopped the vehicle, or he gained control and brought it to a stop. He continued beating her to the brink of death. Marks on her hands suggested she had tried to defend herself. In the dark, Matheson probably didn't realize he was leaving the blood spatters that would be his undoing. Once he was sure that his wife wouldn't survive, he carried her out of the van and ran over her. He carried her back into the van and waited for someone to stop and call for help.
We had, a gut feeling and a lot of suspicions. We didn't have any hard evidence. So Dr. Lee's blood spatter analysis is what gave us our first piece of really hard evidence.
In 1995, Ken Matheson was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and murder. He's not eligible for parole for 25 years. Sometimes a coroner's findings can only tell part of the story. When that happens, forensic criminalists like Dr. Lee give a voice to the victims who would otherwise be silenced forever.
Victim died. She cannot testify. Physical evidence speak for her.
Matheson's simple but gruesome crime was undone by some forensic details that he just didn't count on. But can the same forensic science that proves murder also be used to prove that no murder was committed? Experts in New York State hoped it could. The town of Munnsville in central New York is one of those quiet, picturesque places that blends unnoticed into the landscape as motorists rush past. In June 1990, it became an unlikely battleground for a most unlikely soldier. The trouble started in a shabby farmhouse outside of town. Delbert Ward, 59, awoke at dawn to milk his cows. He'd tried earlier to awaken his brother, William, but he didn't move. William hadn't been feeling well lately. Delbert thought it best to let him sleep. Delbert would take care of the chores without him today. The four Ward brothers were quiet and simple-minded. They'd spent their entire lives on the dairy farm. It was their universe, all they had and all they knew. Reclusive and childlike, the brothers even shared their bed, probably as they had done since boyhood. William, the oldest, was also the smartest and strongest. He ran the show. Delbert was his right-hand man. The other brothers, Roscoe and Lyman, occasionally pitched in to help out. But on this day, June 6th, Delbert was on his own. Even after he finished his chores, he couldn't wake brother William. Something was wrong. Delbert called his brothers. The men didn't know what to do. Because the Ward brothers had no phone, Delbert and Roscoe walked to a neighbor's house to call for help. Their fourth brother, Lyman, watched after William until it arrived. 20 minutes after Delbert placed the call, state troopers and the Madison County coroner appeared at the farm. William's body was examined. No signs of foul play were noted. It seemed that 64-year-old William died peacefully in his sleep. His body was transported to the medical examiner's office, while police interviewed the surviving brothers. In the following days, the brothers tried to get on with their work. It would be difficult without Brother Bill.
Won't give you too much at once. Spill it on yourself.
Delbert's life would be much harder, and his troubles were just beginning. At William's autopsy, the assistant medical examiner took tissue samples and careful notes. No indicators of natural disease were noted in the report. However, something unusual demanded attention. Pinpoint-size hemorrhages in William's eyes, mouth, and windpipe. These tiny spots, called petechial hemorrhages, can have a number of causes. Often, it's the first tip-off to death by suffocation. The assistant medical examiner couldn't rule out death by unnatural means. On the death certificate, cause of death was listed as pending further study. The district attorney was contacted and told the case was bothersome. And here's where communication apparently began to break down. The message was passed along to the state police, and the suspicions about the petechial hemorrhages became garbled along the way. Now, the possibility of homicide became a certainty. Delbert was taken to the station for questioning. He was interviewed for 4 hours.
Isn't it true that you had something to do with him being sick?
His interrogation was not recorded.
I am answering his questions.
According to attorney Ralph Cognetti in Albany, New York, Delbert was confused by all the attention. He only wanted to return to the farm, so he was soon willing to say anything. He signed the confession.
Tell them what they want to hear and they'll let you go home, and that's in fact what they said to him. They certainly didn't let him go home after he confessed. But if you have an opportunity to read the confession, it really sounds like a Harvard dissertation, and you know, certainly inside, that did not come from Delbert's lips.
Nevertheless, the confession, coupled with the autopsy results, were enough to arrest Delbert. Later, a grand jury handed up an indictment against him for second-degree murder. To the people of Munnsville, population 400, it was absurd to think that Delbert would or could have killed his brother. They believed the state had it all wrong. When his bail was set at $10,000, the whole town chipped in and raised the money in a matter of hours. The kindness of the neighbors and the plight of Delbert Ward earned an article in the New York Times. The groundswell of support for Delbert began to grow. A friend of the Wards brought Ralph Cognetti into the case. Based on his conversation with Delbert, Cognetti was convinced of his client's innocence. A review of the evidence suggested that the homicide charge was based more on Delbert's confession than on the physical evidence from the medical examiner's office. As Cognetti was putting his defense together, he received a fateful call. The man identified himself as Cyril Wecht. The name meant nothing to Cognetti.
Here was a gentleman who explained that he was a forensic pathologist from Pittsburgh, and that he had read the article, read the story about the boys, and was willing to review whatever evidence we had without any cost to us.
In other words, what you're telling me is...
Dr. Cyril Wecht's reputation spreads far beyond the walls of the coroner's office in Pittsburgh, where he works as the chief forensic pathologist for Allegheny County. He's helped investigators on the assassination of Robert Kennedy and has consulted in the death of Elvis Presley. Besides degrees in medicine, Wecht also holds a degree in law. He'd read about the Delbert Ward case in the New York Times, and it piqued his interest. He requested William Ward's case file.
After I reviewed the case file, which included the autopsy report, my initial impression was that there was an inadequate basis for any forensic pathologist to conclude that this was an asphyxiation death from suffocation, smothering. There simply were not adequate findings for such a diagnosis.
Using the assistant medical examiner's original notes, Wecht formulated a more mundane diagnosis. William Ward died of heart disease, the #1 killer of men his age in America. The Ward brothers had in fact told authorities that William had been in poor health for years, but he refused to see a physician. His symptoms were consistent with cardiovascular disease, supporting Wecht's theory. But the prosecution believed that William's illness may have provided a motive for his murder. Did Delbert Ward kill his brother William? The state of New York said he did. According to their theory, Delbert suffocated his brother to release him from his failing health. They said that it may have been a mercy killing, but it was murder nonetheless. The prosecution pointed to Delbert's odd behavior on the day of William's death. When Delbert couldn't rouse his brother at the crack of dawn like he normally did, he went about his chores anyhow. To the prosecution, that lack of concern suggested guilt. To Ralph Cognetti, it said more about the realities of life on a farm.
It was a point that the prosecutor jumped on. How could a person who was so concerned about his brother's well-being go and milk cows? What came out at trial, and what I'm sure the jurors knew because we had 1 or 2 dairy farmers on the jury, was that if you don't milk a cow when it needs to be milked, then that cow's going to get very ill.
Cognetti and Cyril Wecht stuck with the idea that William died of natural causes, but they had to prove it. The victim had already been buried. All Wecht had to work from were the autopsy records, those same records and tissue samples that the state claimed showed nothing unusual besides the petechial hemorrhages. That's not how Wecht read them. He was confident that he had everything he needed to prove Ward's innocence. According to the thin tissue samples gathered at William Ward's autopsy, along with the medical examiner's data, William's heart was enlarged and his coronary arteries suffered a blockage of 20%. His right lung was heavily scarred and weighed twice as much as his left. His liver and spleen also were enlarged. Without a drastic change in habits, death by heart disease seemed inevitable for William. But Wecht had to undermine the prosecution's assertion that he was murdered to be relieved of his suffering. Though Wecht had only photographs and tissue samples of William Ward to work from, he called upon his vast experience on other cases, where he had examined the bodies directly. He noted the petechiae, the telltale red hemorrhages found in the victim's eyes and mouth. To the state, these were clear signs of strangling. They eclipsed all other symptoms. While it's true that petechial hemorrhages can indicate smothering, they're not enough to prove it beyond a doubt. Unless a person is somehow incapacitated before he's smothered, the body will likely show signs of a struggle. William Ward's did not.
No injuries around the mouth, in the mouth, and the tongue, the gums. No injuries on or around the neck. No evidence of increased fluidity of the blood. No evidence of increased blueness of the blood. No aspiration of gastric contents that will occur as a person struggles. So we had none of it.
For the defense, there was no evidence of murder. William simply died in his sleep of heart disease. The homicide charge was the result of an unfortunate series of miscommunications that had grown out of control.
or you can take the incident seen by one person and then passed on to a second and to a third. And then when you get down to the 6th or the 10th or the 15th, you'll find that that story bears very little relationship to the original creation, to the original version.
Coming into the case as an outsider, Wecht was immune to the preconceptions that Delbert Ward was a murderer. By looking at the case with a fresh perspective, he won Delbert's freedom. On April 5th, 1991, Delbert Ward was acquitted of all charges.
It grew like a bomb almost. It started small, and then by the end of the trial, he became what he is today, really a legend, certainly in that part of the state.
Cyril Wecht believes that the situation that Delbert Ward found himself in was not unusual. He's seen many cases that were tainted by a medical examiner's wrong assumptions, an investigator's speedy conclusion, or a simple misunderstanding. Unfortunately, these errors tend to compound themselves.
We work closely and constantly with homicide detectives, with police, with district attorneys. We hear their versions. Consciously, subconsciously, those versions begin to take hold. And the mind then begins to work. And you build up then your own impressions, ultimately your own opinions and conclusions that fit in best with those.
No matter how mysterious or suspicious a death may appear, the truth can be resurrected in the lab. Every day, the forensic skills of the medical examiner, coroner, and crime scene expert prove that the most important witness to a death is the deceased. Investigators grapple with the case of a sexual sadist who's leaving behind painfully few clues. Even his victim is anonymous. When a woman steps out of her house and vanishes, detectives find evidence that she's never coming back. With no body, no witnesses, and scant clues, the truth about her fate hangs by a hair. A hideous crime comes to light in a remote river, but all evidence has been washed clean. Investigators have no hope of solving it unless the murderer strikes again. Greed, rage, and revenge provide most killers motivation, but some hunt just for sport. To catch these murderers, investigators must follow a trail of scattered clues. Beneath the gaze of California's Sierra Nevada mountains lies the resort community of Lake Tahoe. Clean air and majestic forests instill a sense of harmony. But for one lost traveler, this was the cruelest place on earth. On September 17, 1987, investigators from the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department were called to an isolated spot off the side of an abandoned service road. The young woman had been gagged with a scrap of pantyhose. Investigators found what they believed to be the murder weapon, a strangulation device made from a tree branch and a shred of the victim's clothing that appeared cut with scissors. Unlike a rope or bare hands, a garrote is primarily used for torture. The killer went to a good deal of trouble to find a place to stage his lengthy assault. Sergeant Jim Watson was surprised to find a body in such a remote spot.
And at that point, it was just a big question mark in my mind. How did she get here? Where did she come from? A lot of unanswered questions at that point, but it was where we started.
What they did know was that the killer must have picked this location ahead of time. The remote service road was hard to find, not a place one simply stumbled upon. And it wasn't chosen merely as a place to dump a body. The path was too steep for carrying the victim. The absence of injury to the soles of her feet told detectives that her shoes weren't removed until she was walked down here. Working outward in a spiral pattern, they scoured the ground for additional clues.
We began a sweep of the entire area from here up to the highway, which is about a third of a mile. That sweep revealed pieces of clothing that were scattered on various bushes and trees from here up to the main highway.
Technicians collected what they believed to be the remains of the victim's outfit: a dress, a pair of underwear, a single shoe, and pantyhose remnants. Not knowing what might be of use later, they also collected a pack of cigarettes and a butane lighter. Some white cord found nearby suggested that the killer restrained his victim before he killed her. Detectives had no clue to the victim's identity, nor any solid leads on her killer. They hoped the medical examiner would give them something they could use. The post-mortem examination placed her between the ages of 16 and 21. She had a large contusion on her head, but that wasn't the fatal injury. The ligature around her neck had ended her life. Based on the amount of decay, the medical examiner estimated that she had died 2 to 4 weeks earlier. No tissue was found under her fingernails. No foreign fluids were found on her body. Technicians used sticky tape to pick up trace fibers from textiles. They processed every square inch of the victim's clothing and cataloged each shred in the hopes that one day they'd find a source of comparison. But without a suspect, this trace evidence was useless. And until they could identify the victim, the murder investigation was at a standstill. A sadistic predator was free to roam and to kill again. Detectives scoured hundreds of missing persons records, but to no avail. The papers published an artist's rendering of the dead woman. Tips poured in from families and friends searching for missing teenage girls. One by one, each was eliminated. There was nothing to do but wait. As months passed, the missing persons search gradually spread up the coast. It wasn't until 4 months later, in January 1988, that police got a call from a Seattle woman who recognized the girl. Dental records finally gave the victim a name. 17-year-old Darcy Frackenpole was a runaway from Seattle who tried to build a life in Sacramento. She ended up working as a prostitute. Friends last saw her on August 24th, 3 weeks before her body was found. For a predator looking to kill, prostitutes make easy targets. Night after night, they let strangers drive them into the darkness. Sometimes they don't come back. Investigators looked for similar attacks on prostitutes in the Sacramento area. One caught their attention. 3 days before Darcy's body was found, another prostitute had a brutal run-in with a customer. While leaning over to lock the door, the man grabbed her wrists and attempted to handcuff her. But before he managed to subdue her, a police officer cruising in the neighborhood noticed the struggling couple and interceded. After the prostitute escaped from the car, the perpetrator tried to bolt, but he was caught.
Put your hands out the window. Out the window. Open the door. Slowly. Keep your hands in the air, face the building, walk backward.
One good look at a bag found on his back seat told police that the prostitute had gotten away just in time. It contained a pair of scissors, handcuffs, and a garrote assembled from 2 wooden dowels and a length of white cord. It seemed to be some sort of crime kit. Police arrested the suspect, 48-year-old Roger Kibbe. A furniture maker by trade, Kibbe had a burglary record that spanned 2 decades. Illiterate but intelligent, acquaintances described him as a quiet man who liked to take long drives at night. He was given an 8-month sentence for assaulting the prostitute. While he was in prison, Darcy Frackenpole had been identified in Lake Tahoe, over 80 miles away, and the hunt was on for her killer. Kibbe's attack on the prostitute in Sacramento and his crime kit gave investigators the haunting suspicion that this wasn't his first strike. They didn't know how many women had made the mistake of climbing into Kibbe's passenger seat. They wondered if Frackenpole was one of them. A garrote is an unusual and memorable weapon. Though the one found in Kibbe's crime kit didn't resemble the makeshift device used to kill Frackenpole, the white cord used in its construction resembled the rope found at her murder scene. And like his assault victim in Sacramento, Frackenpole was a prostitute. Investigators questioned him, hoping that he would incriminate himself in the Frackenpole murder. He denied any involvement. Detectives' suspicions were purely circumstantial. The only thing they had to go on was the nylon cord. It deserved a closer look. Under the magnification of a stereo microscope, technicians compared the cord samples from both Frackenpole's murder scene and Kibbe's car. Both strands contained the same number of fibers, made up of the same weave and pattern. Investigators discovered that this wasn't just household rope. It was parachute cord. They learned that Kibbe worked at a storage facility and rented a unit there. They obtained a warrant to search it.
Oh yeah, right there. It's a skydiving certificate for Roger.
They learned that he enjoyed skydiving, and when they removed a photograph from the wall, they made an unexpected discovery. The picture was hanging from a length of parachute cord, exactly like that found at both crime scenes. But it was hardly a smoking gun. Investigators found nothing to definitively link Kibbe to the death of Darcy Frackenpole. This relatively common rope would not support the weight of a murder investigation. Unless they found more evidence, Kibbe would be out of prison in just a few months, and then would probably disappear. But tiny fibers might prove stronger than sturdy cord. Now that investigators had a suspect, they could compare the trace evidence originally collected from Frackenpole's clothing to fibers collected from Kibbe.
There are many serial type crimes that we don't have blood analysis or DNA analysis, and if there's not bullets or blood or semen, we have no other option other than to look at the particulate or the trace evidence.
At the California Department of Justice Crime Lab, criminalist Faye Springer scrutinized the numerous fiber lifts taken from Darcy Frackenpole's clothing. Hours can be spent analyzing 1 square inch. After 3 weeks, poring over the evidence, Springer found two fibers that stood out because of their larger size. The distinct shape and color of the fiber's cross-section told her that they were fibers from a blue nylon carpet. Here's where her 30 years' experience paid off. She asked investigators to find out what kind of car Kibbe had been driving at the time of the assault. A search warrant was executed, and the suspect's car was taken in for inspection. Springer was on target. The floor mats were blue. What's more, one had a red stain on it. A sample was collected and sent for testing. The results were disappointing. It turned out to be pink. But the blue fibers from Kibbe's car still had forensic value. A sample was compared with the fibers found on the victim's clothing. Not only were the shape and composition of the strands the same, a spectral dye analysis confirmed that they were exactly the same color. Was this proof that Darcy Frackenpole was in Kibbe's vehicle? Not quite. The same blue carpeting could be found in tens of thousands of vehicles. If investigators were going to catch Kibbe, they'd need something more conclusive. But one strange similarity couldn't be accounted for. Both the fibers from the car and the ones from the victim's clothing were peppered with tiny football-shaped specks. Samples of both were sent to a lab in Chicago that specializes in identifying microscopic contaminants. Until the results came back, investigators had no other evidence beside the parachute cord. As they began their careful scrutiny for something they might have overlooked, they realized that Kibbe might have left behind just enough rope to hang himself. In California, criminalist Fay Springer was trying to use 3 lengths of rope to lasso a killer. She examined the ropes under higher and higher magnification until she noticed something strange. The rope found at the Darcy Frackenpole murder scene had tiny red paint flecks in it. So did the cord from the garrote found in Roger Kibbe's car. So did the sample from his storage unit. Spectral analysis showed that the paint on the 3 cords had the same chemical composition, including some microscopic black specks that must have gotten trapped beneath the drying paint. It was a powerful connection.
So it looked like not only did we have the same kind of cordage, but we had cordage that lived or existed in the same environment, was exposed to the same kind of contaminants.
For all intents and purposes, it was the same rope. But investigators needed more to tie up their case. That's when the call came from the testing lab in Chicago. They had finished analyzing the carpet fibers. The unidentified football shapes found on the carpet fibers were fungal spores, single-celled organisms that could have come from dirt or mold. But there was something else. The lab's powerful microscopes had identified a red spot on the carpet fiber found on the victim's clothes. It was paint. It had the same properties as the paint on the floor mat of Kibbe's car. The carpet fibers weren't just similar, they were identical. Both contained the same football-shaped fungal spores and the same paint stains. The victim and suspect had now been irrefutably linked.
What about the other one there?
Roger Kibbe was arrested on April 25, 1988, for the murder of Darcy Frackenpole. By trial time, police had pieced together the details of the victim's last night. She had been working the streets when she accepted an invitation that would turn out to be a date with death. Investigators suspect that after restraining her with the parachute cord, Kibbe brought her to a place he'd selected in advance. After cutting up her clothing and torturing her for several hours, he killed her, then scattered her clothes. Roger Kibbe was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. No one knows how many other victims met a fate similar to Darcy Frackenpole's. At least 3 other murders matching Roger Kibbe's MO are thought to be his work. Had it not been for a powerful microscope and some shrewd detective work, the number might still be rising. Roger Kibbe had covered his tracks by heading out in search of strangers. But not all predators hunt far from home. On a brisk October morning in 1992, neighbors saw Laura Hoteling leave the Bethesda, Maryland home that she shared with her mother. The 24-year-old Harvard graduate moved back after college and had no trouble finding a job at a consulting firm. But on this day, she never made it to work. A close friend and colleague went to check on her. Though the back door was open, she found the house empty.
Anyone home? Laura? Laura? Someone didn't come to work today.
There was no sign of Laura, nor any hint about where she'd gone.
Laura, I know you're here.
She contacted Laura's family, concerned that there was some sort of emergency. They were as puzzled as her friend. Laura's mother cut her business trip short. Neither she nor her son had any idea where Laura could be. She was not the type to run off without leaving word. Serious about her career, Laura was known for her diligence and punctuality. No burdensome secret seemed to be weighing on her mind. She didn't hint about leaving town. Her family filed a missing persons report with the Montgomery County Police. At this point, all Detective Ed Tarney could do was a routine check.
We checked with the friends. They had not heard from her. She did not leave a note. It was just very suspicious. We also, through the course of the investigation, we checked all her credit cards, bank accounts. There had been no activity.
But as missing persons cases go, this was in its infancy. It had only been a few days since Laura Hoteling was last seen. Though there had been no sign of her, there hadn't been any indication of foul play either.
Hey, how's it going, pal?
Good.
Police
Good.
interviewed the Hoteling's friends, their neighbors, their gardener.
Hi, nice to meet you.
I wonder if you'd,
No one could offer any information regarding the woman's disappearance.
you seen her lately?
No.
After seeing her leave for work the previous morning, there'd been no sign of Laura, nor any indication of trouble at her house. But then, as they searched the woods around the house, investigators found something that told them this was more than a missing persons case. The pillowcase and pillow inside it were stained with what appeared to be blood.
When we took the bloody pillowcase back to the house, it matched up with the other pillowcases that were there. And at that time, we knew we had something very, very serious.
To find out more about the stains, investigators turned to forensic scientist Susan Ballou at the Montgomery County Crime Lab.
Want to take the pillowcase off the pillow?
Okay.
Ballou first tested the stains to confirm that they were made by human blood.
We wanted to see if we could pick up a type consistent with Laura. We knew from her donations to the Red Cross facility that she was a type A blood.
The blood stain from the pillow was shown to be of the same type. From its bright red color, Ballou knew that she was looking at stains less than a week old. Though her findings could only prove that someone with type A blood had bled on Laura Hoteling's bedroom pillow, it was enough to turn the missing persons case into a potential homicide. Investigators needed to find out what had happened in Laura's room.
Stains
Beneath the bedspread, they found something strange. There was a flat sheet on the bed, but the fitted sheet was gone. And on the mattress underneath were some faint stains that looked like more blood. Investigators saturated the mattress with a chemical called luminol. When it combines with blood proteins, even those invisible to the naked eye, it glows. Viewed in the dark, Laura's mattress radiated a pattern of blood spots and streaks that spelled murder.
There was a large quantity of blood that showed up on that bed. That's when we knew she had probably been murdered there in her bedroom.
The lack of spatter on the surrounding walls or furniture told detectives that the killer had used the pillow to staunch the blood flow. The absence of a blood trail leading from the bedroom suggested that the killer had either cleaned his tracks or wrapped the body before removing it from the house. Investigators collected fibers and samples of Laura's hair in case they ever had the need to make a comparison. Meantime, technicians searched the pillowcase for any link to the suspect. A crucial detail surfaced. Based on the repeated pattern of triangular smears, they surmised that the killer had stabbed the victim with a narrow, pointed weapon, which was then wiped on the fabric. Hidden in the corner of the pillowcase, Ballou uncovered a more significant discovery.
And when I looked at these areas closely, I could see partial impressions of prints on them, which turned out to be what's called a patent print, a print that is made in blood. However, there was not sufficient ridge detail to get enough information from it.
In its current state, the print was too vague to be used for identification. But criminalists like Ballou have ways of turning faint prints into glaring evidence. She applied a protein-sensitive dye to enhance the pattern.
See what we can do with it.
Now that they had a viable print, all they needed was a suspect.
Hold this here so I can rinse some more off.
Mrs. Hoteling couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm her daughter. She did recall, though, that their gardener, Haddon Clark, had been fascinated by Laura since his first day on the job. She also told police that she'd discovered her spare key was missing. Clark had worked for the family for several months. During the day, he was allowed in to use their bathroom or help himself to some coffee. Overnight, he lived out of a truck that he kept in a nearby church parking lot.
How long have you been working for the hotel?
Though Clark denied any knowledge of an attack on Laura Hoteling, his agitated behavior cast him in doubt. It wasn't Clark's first brush with the law. He had once been arrested on a burglary charge. When Clark's prints were compared against the patent print from the pillowcase, they matched. The suspicious gardener had left his print in wet blood on the victim's bedroom pillow. And the only way he could have done that, police contended, was if he had killed her. Though they still had no body, police arrested Clark on November 6, 1992. Inside his truck, along with his gardening tools, they found a hardware store receipt for carpenter's twine, duct tape, and plastic sheeting. Ordinarily harmless materials that homicide investigators see more than their share of. Detectives believed that Clark was the killer. Proving it would be another matter. Despite the circumstantial evidence heaped against him, all police had was a bloody fingerprint. Clark's lawyers were already formulating their rebuttal. The homeless man regularly scavenged through trash in the woods. He could have easily left an innocent fingerprint on the pillowcase. It was up to the prosecution to prove otherwise.
So at that point, we realized the fingerprint was not going to be the crux of this particular case, and we had to go further.
Despite his dubious profile, detectives didn't have a single shred of physical evidence to tie Clark to the murder. And without a body, the case would be nearly impossible to prove. Investigators searched Clark's squalid campsite for a weapon, or even a body, but no weapons were found. and the only bodies were the game he trapped for food. Detectives began to scour the place for tinier clues to prove Laura had been there, but realized that finding anything of value in this hovel would be impossible. The trial date was just weeks away. If the prosecution failed to convince a jury of Clark's guilt, they wouldn't be able to try him again, even if the body turned up later. And without any convincing evidence, it seemed their case against the gardener would wither on the vine. The trial date was drawing near, and Maryland investigators needed to find some physical link between Haddon Clark and the victim, Laura Hoteling. Because the victim's body hadn't been found, the case would have to hinge on other evidence. Investigators were at a loss to determine what that evidence might be. While they searched the suspect's belongings, forensic technician Susan Ballou continued processing the evidence from the crime scene. In preparation for any possible hair comparison, Ballou inspected more than 90 hairs taken from the victim's hairbrush and made a shocking discovery.
When I started to do that, I noticed that one of the fibers I put under the microscope was a wig fiber. And it just jumps out at you. It is so different from an actual hair, and it caught me off guard. May I speak to Ed Tarney, please?
Ballou learned that none of the victim's family or friends owned or wore wigs. From receipts found in Clark's truck, investigators learned of a storage facility that he rented in Rhode Island. Investigators realized that his penchant for dressing up might be the one thing that could finally expose him. If technicians could prove that the single wig fiber found in the victim's brush had come from one of the suspect's wigs, they would be able to show that he had been at the scene of the crime, disguised. Ballou pulled sample hair fibers from each of the 24 wigs and compared them to the single wig fiber found in the victim's hairbrush.
After looking at under the microscope at all the different fibers from these wigs, I found one wig that the fiber from that wig had the same color composition, the same diameter. It also had the same internal characteristics as that one wig fiber that I recovered from that hairbrush.
Now that Ballou had narrowed her search to one wig, she sent it with the original strand to a crime lab that specializes in hair testing. The last and most definitive test would compare the dyes in both samples. Though indistinguishable to the human eye, each wig manufactured in the U.S. has a unique fingerprint. Each of the approximately 7,000 commercial dyes is trademarked by the company that formulated it. The lab studied the samples under a microscope sensitive to ultraviolet rays. They called Ballou with their findings.
They were able to determine that that dye content in the wig, as well as that question fiber recovered from the brush, were in fact one and the same.
Clark's defense attorneys couldn't get around this single strand of hair. Realizing he couldn't skirt the evidence, Clark confessed. He plea bargained to murder in the second degree. In exchange for the reduced charge, he agreed to reveal Laura Hoteling's grave, located near his campsite. Clark admitted to having stabbed the victim with a pair of scissors. The autopsy concluded she was also suffocated. Ultimately, investigators pieced together her final hour. Driven by sick obsession, Clark learned that his victim would be alone while her mother was out of town. Using the spare key, he entered the house, smothered Hoteling with a pillow, then stabbed her in the neck. Clark must have rolled the body in the missing bedsheet, then wrapped it with the plastic and tape he'd purchased from the hardware store. He loaded the body in the truck and drove to a clearing near his campsite, where a shallow grave awaited. The following morning, Clark returned to the scene of the crime to clean up and cover his tracks. He figured that by posing as Laura Hoteling, he'd throw any nosy neighbors off his track. His last look in the mirror would prove his undoing. Without the ironclad forensic case against him, Clark probably would have never confessed. His victim's body might still be lying in a lonely grave, and Haddon Clark might have extended his killing streak. Thankfully, the devious killer couldn't escape the evidence. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison.
Please hurry, he's trying to kill me.
There's no telling where a trail of evidence might lead. Sometimes investigators stumble onto more than they bargained for. At 4:30 a.m. on January 21st, 1995, the Marion County, Oregon police received a phone call from a prostitute named Lisa Louise Benson, who claimed to have been attacked. Benson was brought to the hospital for treatment. Lieutenant Bob Stye questioned her about the terrifying ordeal.
She had ligature marks across her neck and also had an abrasion and the signs of bruising on the back of her neck, and had abrasions on her hands and up on her knees.
Her injuries were photographed as evidence. Earlier that morning, she told investigators a customer had tried to kill her. She'd never seen the man before, but he didn't appear threatening. She climbed into his truck. He brought Benson to a retail carpet outlet. After roughing her up in an office, he forced her into the warehouse. He tied her to a forklift and told her she was going to die.
And then hoisted her, literally hoisted the lift up to where she was dangling with her feet about 6 or 8 inches off the ground.
She hung there for almost a minute. Then the rope broke and she fought her way free. The plastic wrap that bound her wrists was taken into evidence. Police learned from the carpet store manager that one employee, Larry Reed, fit the suspect's description. When Reed showed up to work the next day, police were there to meet him. He admitted that he'd picked up a hooker the night before, but when questioned about it, he became evasive and uncooperative. He refused to give any more information without an attorney present. Police heard all they needed. They arrested Reed for the attempted murder of Lisa Benson. A look into his background revealed a disturbing history of assaults on little girls and elderly women. He had been institutionalized more than once, but nothing, it seemed, could tame his instinct to prey on vulnerable females. Reed fit the profile of a sadistic sexual predator, but so far the case against him was based only on the word of a prostitute. To make the conviction stick, detectives needed physical evidence proving that he caused her injuries. They obtained a warrant to search the office where Benson claimed to have been attacked. They found blood spatter throughout the office. The pattern of droplets revealed repeated blows to the body, probably with a blunt instrument. The underside of the carpet disclosed 2 large bloodstains, although the top of the carpet had been cleaned. Criminalists are often called on to build a case from a single drop of blood. In this case, however, they had copious amounts. They found more on the dashboard, glove compartment, and steering column of Reed's car. The evidence was sent to the lab. The results were anything but routine. Tests confirmed that all the samples were blood, but not a drop of it came from Lisa Benson. Investigators in Oregon faced an unnerving predicament. Their routine investigation into Lisa Benson's assault had exposed a much greater crime. Not only was Benson's blood a mismatch, the spatter and saturated carpet didn't correspond to her injuries. Forensics determined that the amount of bloodshed indicated that someone had been brutally murdered in the manager's office. Now they had a homicide investigation with no clues about the victim. They didn't even know when he or she was killed. They did, however, have a suspect, Larry Reed. His manager at the carpet warehouse told investigators that almost 2 months earlier, Reed had said he needed his carpet cleaned. Reed explained the situation to his boss.
Mr. Reed had reported that a customer had come into the business during the evening hours of December 7th, and that this person had complained about being sick and had gone into this office and had thrown up, and in throwing up he had also thrown up some blood.
The story was unlikely, but at least it gave investigators a time frame for the murder. A little research brought to light an unsolved murder in the next county. In December 1994, fishermen noticed something peculiar floating in the Santiam River. Closer inspection revealed it was a body. They marked the location and contacted the sheriff's office. Investigators retrieved the nude body of a woman from the muddy water. Though the water had distorted her features beyond recognition, the numerous wounds to her head were plain to see. Someone had murdered this woman and dumped her body into the river. These murky depths, the killer hoped, would conspire to keep his secrets hidden forever. The medical examiner determined that the victim was around 40 years old. The degree of tissue decay and the amount of mud and algae coating the body told him that she'd been in the water for several weeks. 7 penetrating wounds had fractured her skull, inflicting fatal damage. From the size and magnitude of the wounds, the pathologist believed the murder weapon to be a tool with a hammerhead on one side and a cutting blade on the other. Identifying the victim would be a challenge. Because she had no fillings, there would be no dental records for comparison. And because of her time in the water, technicians were unable to render fingerprints by the standard inking method. But they had other ways. The hands were amputated according to standard scientific practice and sent to the police lab. There, highly detailed photographs of the fingertips were taken. These photographs were compared to a police database of fingerprints from women matching the victim's description. They came up with a match. The fingerprints belonged to Marjorie Lynn Sessions, a 38-year-old prostitute.
Detectives from the Lynn County Sheriff's Office, which is south of us, advised that they were working a homicide case involving a woman named Margie Sessions. The detectives from Lynn County advised that Margie's lifestyle was one of being involved with the methamphetamine use and prostitution.
December 7th, the same day that Reed reported the bloody carpet stain, was the day Marjorie Sessions had last been seen alive. Since both women were prostitutes, it appeared that his attack on Lisa Benson was part of his chilling pattern.
And so it was those two significant facts that led detectives to kind of put the two cases together.
Only a DNA test could definitively link Reed to the murder of Marjorie Sessions. If the victim's DNA matched DNA taken from the blood found at the carpet warehouse, investigators would have their man. It wasn't so easy. The victim had been in the river so long that the water degraded the DNA in her blood. But there was one last chance. In March 1995, 3 months after her death, the victim's body was exhumed. Technicians extracted dental pulp and bone marrow. From these samples, they generated a DNA barcode. In order to confirm that the DNA had not been degraded, technicians compared it against tissue samples from the victim's parents. The genetic pattern was intact. When tested against the blood samples from the suspect's office, it matched the DNA pattern for every stain collected. The blood work proved that Marjorie Sessions had been wounded in Larry Reed's office and that the suspect had transferred some of the blood to the interior of his vehicle. But it couldn't prove for a fact that Larry Reed had killed her. The only way to do that would be to establish a relationship between the suspect and the dumping of the body. Before they could solve this case, investigators had one more river to cross. In order to prove that Larry Reed had murdered Marjorie Sessions, detectives needed to show that the suspect was responsible for disposing of her body in the river. Scouring police records for similar attacks in the area, they made a crucial discovery. Back on December 7th, the day after Sessions was last seen alive, an illegal dumping report was filed in neighboring Polk County. Residents had reported a man fitting Reed's description getting out of a pickup truck to dump trash along a roadside.
Make sure we get that tag.
The bag, which bore traces of blood, contained blood-stained paper towels. Mixed among them was a single sheet of plastic shrink wrap. Nearby, investigators found a carpet remnant, also spotted with blood. They had no way to trace whose blood it was or who had dumped the trash there until now. Samples had been saved and were brought to the forensics lab. Each item was carefully studied. The single piece of plastic wrap was compared with the wrap collected from the Benson case. Criminalist Brad Putnam performed the analysis.
The first thing we did was look at the class characteristics, the physical characteristics of the plastic. Is it clear? Is it colored? Is it opaque? Can you see through it? We took measurements of the thickness, of the width.
Experts couldn't prove that the plastic wrap found at the dump site came from the same roll as the plastic used to gag Lisa Benson. But they were able to prove that it was identical to the wrap found at the factory where Reed worked. It was of the exact same shape, width, and coloring.
Now that was real significant for us because we knew Mr. Reed worked as a carpet salesman. We also knew that at the carpet store, he had used plastic shrink wrap on Miss Benson to put around her mouth and around her throat. And we had the same type of plastic wrap found at the illegal dump site.
The blood found on the carpet and paper towels sealed Reed's fate. It matched the blood found in his office. It had come from Marjorie Sessions. Based solely on forensic evidence, detectives had pieced together the details of her murder, from initial contact to the time her body entered the water.
Forensics supported witness statements from the unlawful dumping. It helped solidify some of the theories that may have been going on and really tied kind of a multi-jurisdictional nightmare into a nice, tidy package for the prosecution.
There you go. Mine's Larry. Marjorie.
Janice.
Police believe that on the night of December 7th, Reed picked up Sessions at a bar.
I'll catch you later. Okay. See you later.
As he had done with Benson, he brought her back to his manager's office, where things turned violent. Repeated blows to her head ended her life. Reed then dumped the body in the Santiam River. Even if she were eventually found, he thought, there would be no way to tie her to him. But Reed underestimated the power of forensics to draw a link with Marjorie Sessions, to coax DNA from the grave, and to turn flimsy bits of trash into an incontrovertible murder charge.
Confronted with that much physical evidence, it's pretty hard to deny involvement.
Reed was sentenced to 40 years for the murder of Marjorie Sessions and the attack on Lisa Benson. Thanks to the forensics analysis, a case that seemed destined to go unsolved was proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. And a predator who may have gone on hunting for years was stopped in his tracks. Honing their skills with each attack, sadistic killers are some of the most difficult criminals to catch. Today, science is giving law enforcement the edge. With the use of advanced forensic techniques, investigators can build a solid case from the scattered clues they leave in their wake. Investigators hoping to solve a difficult murder case have a creeping suspicion about who did it. But to catch the killer, they must first trap their witnesses. Detectives at the scene of a young woman's murder learn that the best tool to capture her killer may be a dustpan. Everyone's a suspect when a woman is murdered in her hotel room.
God, what's happening?
Investigators look to the killer's own hand to prove his guilt. In the absence of human bystanders, sometimes insects or even microbes can provide the most objective testimony. When death doesn't come by natural causes, solving it often depends upon a natural witness.
David 31.
In this case, some of the names have been changed.
Missing person report.
On August 4th, 1982, the Ventura County, California Sheriff's Department received a call about a missing woman. When 25-year-old Marcy Davis hadn't been heard from in almost 2 days, her sister became worried. Several hours later, the department received a call about a vehicle stuck and abandoned in a ditch. A check of the plates revealed that it belonged to Marcy Davis. There was no sign of her. She might have walked away to find help and possibly run into worse trouble. Or someone else may have ditched the vehicle. The cold engine made it impossible to determine how long it had been there. A pair of women's jeans found nearby suggested foul play. But the place was used as a dumping ground for all sorts of trash. Because the car provided the first real clue to Marcy Davis's fate, Ventura County sheriffs scoured the scene to see what else they might find. They prepared for the worst. They found it. Assigned to the case was Sergeant Larry Robertson.
The patrol division had decided that they should bring in a search and rescue team to look for the body. In fact, they did find the body. She had been found strangled and left nude, buried under leaves and debris.
Have you called forensics?
Marcy Davis's blouse had been torn and tied tightly around her neck. It appeared she might have been raped. The forensics team photographed any clues they could find in the gloom, but decided to abandon the scene until daylight. A guard was posted to keep it secure. Investigators had plenty of other work to do before sunrise.
Hey, have you seen my cigarettes? Mm-mm. Can I take yours?
The victim's sister told police that Marcy had left the house on the night of August 3rd to go to a Tupperware party. She said that afterward she was going to JJ's, her favorite hangout.
Buy you more Tupperware?
Yes.
Hi, how you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. Came by, we wanted to ask you a
Detectives
couple of
talked to the
questions
bartender
about,
at JJ's.
Can you describe the men she was with?
She told them that the victim had come in around 11 the night she disappeared.
Meets with her friends.
She said that Davis was drinking and playing pool with another bar regular named Michael Nottingham. They left with all the other patrons around closing time, 2 a.m. Because Nottingham was the last person the victim had been with, investigators went to see him.
At the time, we feared that perhaps Michael Nottingham was with her, and he also had been a homicide victim. And we just hadn't found his body yet. So, number one, we were trying to establish whether or not his well-being could be verified.
They found him safe at home. He agreed to come to the station to talk. They showed him a photograph of Marcy that her sister provided.
That's Teresa.
He recognized the face, but not the name.
She told you her name is Teresa? That's what she said.
He knew her as Teresa.
This is...
She gave him a ride home, came in for about 10 minutes, then left. That's the last he saw of her, he said.
Wait, license is suspended? No, just want to call.
Nottingham told them that after she drove off around 3 a.m., he walked to his girlfriend's house and crashed outside until her mother left at 9:30. He said that nobody saw him during that time. After Nottingham gave his statement, police went to the house he shared with his sister. They wanted to speak with her to see if she could confirm his alibi. She recognized the face in the picture as a woman Michael came home with the other night. She corroborated his account of the time spent at home, up to a point. She said he introduced the woman as Kelly, and that wasn't the only difference.
She recalled that Michael and Kelly both got into her car and left together. Obviously, this was very different from the statements that Michael had given to us.
The sheriff's department now had a conflicting story and a 6-hour gap in Michael Nottingham's alibi.
Be the right foot sticking up.
Okay.
Suspicion was building, but they had nothing solid.
That's where we are. Some cigarettes.
Any forensic clues found in the victim's car would only support Nottingham's account that he'd been in it.
Go up and give us some aerials.
Investigators needed something to prove that Nottingham had been at the crime scene.
Right about here. Okay. And the body's up here.
Okay.
Okay, now what's going on?
Okay. What I found.
By the light of day, investigators returned to the scene to search for any clues to link him there. The lengthy process left no stone or leaf unturned.
While processing this scene, I sat on the ground in the immediate vicinity of the body, and as we were taking leaf and branches off one at a time looking for evidence, I sat on the ground next to the body for, I would say, at least an hour, perhaps an hour and a half.
And this we found about 6 feet away from the vehicle, cigarette butts.
Investigators found a tentative clue,
Imprint, so in the same area as the
a filterless cigarette butt on the ground near the abandoned vehicle matched Nottingham's brand. The clue was weak, but coupled with the conflicting stories, it allowed police to arrest Nottingham on suspicion of rape and murder. All they had to do now was prove it. Nottingham was taken into custody. As a matter of course, for cases of sexual assault, he was stripped and photographed.
Take off your shirt for us.
Investigators looked for scratches, scrapes, or any other evidence to indicate he may have struggled with his victim. They found something else entirely.
What about the...
As many as 100 small and unusual insect bites dotted his ankles and waistline. Nottingham said they were flea bites. Investigators weren't sure of their significance, but they documented the marks just in case. That night, Sergeant Robertson was awakened by itching around his ankles and waist. He recognized the unforgettable symptoms.
I told my wife if I didn't know better, I would say that these bites on me that itched profusely were chigger bites, and they were just exactly like the chigger bites I had experienced in guerrilla warfare training in Kentucky during the Vietnam era.
That these are the sites where they normally attack.
After his physician confirmed his diagnosis, detectives wondered if these little creatures could somehow provide their big break.
I've got a ball in here.
They needed an expert's advice. They consulted entomologist James Webb, who specializes in parasitic insects. He told them that chiggers are larvae, the newly hatched spawn of a certain group of mites. They're born with a voracious appetite and are adept at procuring their meal.
And they insert their mouth parts into the host's skin, and then with this special blade, there's one on each side, and then they'll actually inject saliva into the wound, and the saliva then dissolves the protein of the skin, and that pool of liquid then is actually sucked into the chigger with a special gut pump. It brings the material into the intestine, into the gut of the chigger.
The saliva triggers the host's immune system, causing a red, itchy bump around the bite, usually within 24 to 48 hours. A survey of the investigators who searched the scene of Marcy Davis's murder revealed that most bore the telltale marks of a chigger attack.
It's not by the individual bite that we recognize the chigger bite. We recognize it more as a pattern, and usually at a place where there's constriction of clothing. Because when the chigger moves up the body, it'll stop along the sock line, or the panty line, or the underwear line, or the belt line.
Out of a case with no real clues, a pattern began to emerge. Michael Nottingham's bite marks were carefully photographed again at life size. It appeared the murder might have had dozens of witnesses after all. Investigators hoped that by catching chiggers, they could catch Marcy Davis's killer.
I think we can do it before the
Suspect Michael Nottingham swore he'd never been to the area where the victim's body was found. Sergeant Larry Robertson believed the chigger bites on Nottingham's body might tell a different story.
But I had never, ever experienced chiggers in all my years of living in Ventura County Even though I was active in search and rescue and hunting and fishing, I had never heard of chiggers in Ventura County, had never seen them, and had never read about them in Ventura County.
In fact, they were exceedingly rare in this part of California. If investigators could isolate chiggers to the crime scene, they would have undeniable proof that Nottingham had been there. They called on Dr. Webb for help.
The thing we wanted to do at the crime scene was see if there were chigger mites there to substantiate this hypothesis. And we knew that lizards are good indicators of finding chiggers.
Chiggers attach to lizards and feed off them. Traps were laid to catch the lizards for examination. Once they were found to be infested, Webb and his team broke out the chigger traps. A chigger trap is nothing more than a small black plastic plate that's placed where chiggers are likely to gather. The sun heats it up, providing a warm welcome for the pesky larvae. These creatures are hungry, not smart.
This thing is a warm body, much like a living animal. And so the chiggers, if they're in the vicinity, will move towards the plate and crawl around on the plate, looking for a place to attach.
Webb's team set their traps outside the house of Nottingham's girlfriend, where Nottingham claimed he spent the night sleeping. They placed more traps 20 feet away from the murder scene, and others even closer to the spot where the victim had been found. They checked the traps every half hour during daylight for 3 days. The results were clear.
Not too far from the murder scene, where the body was found, we were getting 10s or 20 or more at a time running around in the black plate. I mean, just large numbers. We also noticed them running around in our shoes when we were standing in that same spot and crawling up onto us.
But just 20 feet away from the body, the chigger activity was minimal. And at the girlfriend's house, they found none at all. The proximity of the chiggers to the victim established Nottingham's presence at the crime scene.
I believe from our research, this was the first time that entomology had ever been used in a capital case, a murder case, to assist investigators in placing the suspect at the scene of the crime.
From what police could piece together, the victim drove Nottingham to the woods. Maybe she wanted to go, maybe he forced her to go there. Once there, they began to fight. It escalated, and Nottingham beat and killed her, finally strangling her with her shirt. Michael Nottingham was convicted of attempted rape and the first-degree murder of Marcy Davis. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. Danger can lurk on the outskirts of town, or it may lurk even closer to home. Seattle, Washington. Once a rugged forest land, now it's a world-class city of 500,000. Some people come here to take advantage of new opportunities. Others come here just to take advantage. 28-year-old Molly McClure had grown up in Seattle and had been away a few years. In October 1985, she moved back to be closer to her family. She rented a modest apartment and found a job she loved as a hotel restaurant consultant. In January 1986, she called the police to report an attempted break-in at her apartment. Her upstairs neighbor, Sherwood Knight, told her he'd seen someone trying to jimmy her window while he was out for his morning jog. He scared the intruder off. The tampering on the window was plain to see.
See right there and right there.
The police made out a
I'm just being
report.
concerned about Marley, you know what I'm saying? I
That
don't
seemed
want
like
nothing
the
really
end
happen
of
to
it.
her 'cause she just moved there.
But the next day, January 17th, police were called once again to McClure's apartment. They arrived there at the request of her boss, who had phoned them when she failed to show up for work and didn't answer her phone. Officers found her door locked and noticed what appeared to be some new damage to the window. Fearing that McClure might be in trouble, the officers slipped inside.
What'd you check it over there?
They saw no signs of disturbance. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, in the bedroom, they found Molly McClure murdered in her bed.
Headquarters, we got a homicide over here. I'm gonna need the detective. Does it seem to be working that way?
Homicide was called in. Detective Hank Gruber was assigned to the case.
The young lady was laying face down on the bed, and she was partly covered with a blanket, but her head was exposed. She had obvious wounds to the back of her head. There was a gag in her mouth with panties, and they were tied with a sock.
The medical examiner was able to tell from the hemorrhages in the victim's eyes that she had been strangled. From the degree to which blood had pooled in her body, the ME could tell she had been dead 4 or 5 hours. While the apartment was processed for fingerprints or any other clues, the medical examiner carefully collected visible fibers and loose hairs from the body. The intensity of the crime scene processing was momentarily broken. Sherwood Knight came by to return a cookbook he'd borrowed.
The neighbor from upstairs?
How you doing? We're just doing a little checking around here. May I have your name,
He was concerned about Molly and stunned to hear that she was dead.
Oh, this is a book I got.
I'll tell you what, I'd like to do some more talking.
The detective sent him on his way and went back to processing the scene. The Washington State Crime Lab would scrutinize the trace evidence they gathered. Detectives hoped that the solution to this case, if it existed at all, lay somewhere in these small bags.
We had no idea who did this. It wasn't like there were any witnesses or anything to go on, and the case was easily recognized as a case that, if it was going to be solved, would have to be done with trace evidence.
Whoever had tried to invade McClure's apartment the night before had evidently returned to finish what he'd started. From the looks of it, Molly McClure's killer came in through the window of the spare bedroom. There, investigators found a footprint on the sill that didn't match the officer's shoes. This was their first clue that was bigger than a hair, and it needed to be preserved. After the sill was photographed, technicians collected it.
If you can actually take the item that has the print on it, you have a way better chance of being successful in comparisons than through pictures. The actual item is always better. So we took the windowsill at that time, and we had our samples from around the house.
The print on the windowsill had to wait until investigators could find a shoe to compare it with. While the trace evidence was being analyzed, detectives sought to find rhyme or reason for the crime. The curious thing was why the culprit made 2 attempts to enter the victim's apartment. Detectives thought that McClure might have been a victim of circumstance. The couple that lived in the apartment before her had a history of domestic violence.
Can I help you?
The boyfriend had moved out several months earlier. Police theorized that he might have returned to kill his former girlfriend, not realizing that she too had moved away.
Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah, she's married. She's here. Hey, Christy, you want to come on out?
But when police paid him a visit, they found the couple had reconciled.
Hi.
Though the victim's apartment wasn't ransacked, police noticed her jewelry box was empty. A check of bank records showed that the victim's cash machine card was used at an ATM several blocks away around the time of her death. So in addition to murder and rape, the killer had come there to rob. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the rapist's blood was type O, but so was the victim's. No more detailed analysis could be performed on the samples. The medical examiner sent the trace evidence from the sheets to the state crime lab, where it was analyzed by supervising forensic scientist Chesterine Swicklick, now with Swicklick and Associates. She can tell a great deal from small fibers.
Everybody has the characteristics that are debris on them. Everybody has just particles and fibers which may be found on nobody else in the world. We shed our hairs. We go to work and pick up fibers from the seat that we're sitting on, and we may pick up, if the person who worked there with us has a dog and deposited dog hairs on that seat, we pick up some of those dog hairs, and it then becomes part of our set of debris.
Every time we're in contact with someone, we swap some of our debris. At a crime scene, it's up to forensics to determine whose is whose. Swicklick identified a piece of lint from clothing, blue synthetic fibers, a flake of tobacco removed from under the victim's fingernail, some cat hair, and 18 fragments of dark human hair. She determined that characteristics of the hair suggested it was from an African American. It was definitely not that of blonde, blue-eyed Molly McClure. Detectives returned to the scene to collect more clues. The debris didn't seem like the victim's, as she was also a non-smoker who was allergic to cats. But if the killer had left these traces, they would be concentrated around the victim and not elsewhere in the apartment. They collected samples of the debris from the floor of each room, moving to the corners where it tends to gather. They found no cat fur, no tobacco, no African American hairs. A picture of the killer was emerging out of the dust. He could have been an anonymous intruder or someone closer to home. In a murder investigation, it's easier to eliminate familiar faces before looking for new suspects. Sherwood Knight, who had frightened off the burglar at the victim's window, had been helpful in the investigation, but detectives ran a check on him anyway. Gruber's partner, Detective Rudy Sutlovich, discovered that Knight had a record.
And he had a history of robberies and burglaries and other assaults. And he had been released from prison approximately 3 months prior to this.
Thank you very much. Officer Smith here with me.
Detectives paid a visit to Sherwood Knight and his girlfriend. The couple lived in the apartment above the victims. Knight's girlfriend told detectives that they had had a fight the night McClure was murdered.
And so then you came back, noticed
Sherwood slept on the couch. She told police that she woke around 5:30 a.m.
I don't think so.
Knight was already out for his morning jog. He came home a short time later, wearing his jogging clothes like he always did. Then he rushed off for his class at North Seattle Community College.
He was enrolled there, but nobody could ever remember seeing him. Didn't go to his classes or anything, but he had been telling his girlfriend that he was going to school during the daytime.
Based on his past record, investigators thought Knight might be guilty of more than playing hooky.
I got it.
Detective Sepalich, I have a search warrant.
A search
Step
warrant?
aside, please. Yes, we have some work we need to do here.
On January 21st, 4 days after the murder, detectives served a search warrant on Knight's apartment.
Questions at this point.
They were authorized to gather trace evidence collected from the corners of the apartment. Fiber samples from blankets, cat hair, the clothing Knight was said to have worn the night of the murder, and even the clothing he wore when they served the warrant. As it turned out, he was wearing the sweatshirt he usually jogged in.
Shirt, pants, shoes too, please. Guys, let's
Detectives found the jogging pants soaking in a bucket of water.
Yep.
They collected the pants, bucket and all.
Thanks.
Knight was read his rights and taken into custody. There, his hair, blood, and saliva samples were collected. Authorities could hold him no longer than 48 hours unless the tests turned up evidence to directly link him to the crime. The shoe print left on the victim's windowsill matched the tread on running shoes taken from the suspect. But the sneaker was common, and the print would match thousands of others all over Seattle. Testing the trace evidence was more time-consuming. The pants had to be dried before they were looked at. The fibers had to be scrutinized one by one. Even matching hairs is tricky because two hairs taken from the same person might not necessarily match.
If you just look at your own hair, the hair of someone who's sitting next to you, you could see some hairs are thicker, some are thinner, some are darker, some are lighter, some are coarser, some are finer.
The 48 hours came and went without a definitive result. Knight had to be released. But little by little, the trace evidence began to tell the bigger story. The distinctive shape and pattern of some hairs revealed that they were from a cat. Their length and color matched Knight's pet. Then, Swicklick analyzed Sherwood Knight's pants. Red cotton fibers and cat hair were entangled in pills of lint found clinging to them. The pills matched the lint found on the victim. She still wasn't satisfied.
Even though it's very compelling evidence, I would have to say there is a possibility it could have come from another pair of pants with red cotton and with cat hairs. Cats are not a rare species. The red cotton is not unusual.
As her testing continued, more fibers on the victim matched other items taken from Knight's apartment. His hairs, too, matched those from the crime scene. As incriminating as that evidence seemed to be, investigators feared that no jury would buy a case that was solved by lint and cat hair. They sought an array of evidence since no single irrefutable piece had been found. But they were getting closer. They discovered telltale bloodstains around the waistband of Knight's sweatshirt. The droplets had apparently escaped Knight's notice. Technicians tested them against the suspect's and victim's own blood. Though tests weren't as precise in the 1980s as they are today, the blood was found to be consistent with the victim's, a Caucasian with type O. Now, investigators had blood as well as hair and fibers to implicate the suspect.
All these little circumstances would not be sufficient to charge somebody with a murder or any crime. But accumulating each one of these little circumstances, they all add up so long as they're all consistent with the same conclusion, which is that Sherwood Knight was in Molly's apartment that morning and that he's the one who committed the murder.
Investigators were ready to bring him in. The only problem was where to find him. When Seattle police went to arrest Sherwood Knight for the murder of Molly McClure, they learned he'd fled. A manhunt eventually led to an informant who told police of his whereabouts.
How about you, partner? Change the car.
On April 23rd, Sherwood Knight was arrested.
To go with me. What?
Based on the evidence and interviews with Knight's acquaintances, a picture of the victim's last hours came into focus. Sherwood Knight had faked the first break-in so that he could scope out the victim's apartment while winning her trust. The next night, he broke in, attacked, and killed her, but not before forcing her to reveal her cash machine password. For his crimes, Sherwood Knight received life without parole. The McClure case was solved on the combined weight of tiny fibers, a drop of blood, and a few strands of cat hair. In a hotel in Ohio, investigators had even less to link a killer to the crime scene. Blue Ash, Ohio is a quiet town just outside of Cincinnati. People here guard their privacy. In this story, the names of the victim and her family have been changed. On September 3rd, 1994, Bert Stein and June Mays had come to Blue Ash for a family reunion. They'd left their sister, Rose Levy, in the room while they went to breakfast. Rose had promised to join them, but hadn't made it.
Oh my goodness, Rose.
I don't know.
Rose, is she breathing?
A joyful occasion turned into a family tragedy when they discovered 68-year-old Rose collapsed on the floor of their suite. They had been gone only 30 minutes.
Hello, desk.
She clung to life,
This is room
but just
220.
barely.
Yeah, there's somebody down. Please send somebody.
From the looks of it, she had suffered a heart attack or a stroke.
Move back. Everybody please move back.
Medical technicians raced to save her. Police arrived too as part of their normal procedure. Rose Levy died in the hospital. It wasn't a heart attack or stroke that killed her. She had been beaten to death. By the time the victim reached the hospital, bruises and welts had begun to form. Among them were heel marks on her chest and a strange rectangular mark evidently caused by the murder weapon. The medical examiner couldn't discern what it was. Further examination revealed that 2 of the victim's teeth had been knocked out and several bones in her face had been fractured. The damage she received was equal to what a body endures when it hits a brick wall at 40 miles per hour. This was the unforgettable face of a homicide. Blue Ash, Ohio police launched an investigation. The room was cordoned off and scoured for clues. Determining the useful clues wasn't easy. Assigned to the case were detectives Jim Schaefer and Larry Stokes.
The crime scene was extremely contaminated by the time investigators got there, but it was only because of the attempts to resuscitate her.
Detective Jim Schaefer.
Besides blood, there was a footprint that was discovered in the bathroom, and a lot of other items that were later found to be items left by rescue workers.
Rose, you awake? Are you there?
According to June Mays and Bert Stein, Rose was still dressing when they were ready to go to breakfast.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
She told the couple to go ahead without her.
All right, don't forget.
She'd be down in a minute to join them.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
She's going to take a shower.
she never made it. As the investigation continued, some items were discovered missing. Mays, who left her purse in the room while she was at breakfast, noticed that $500 was taken from it.
Thank you, ma'am. And where did you leave that purse?
Later, the victim's family realized that when Rose was rushed to the hospital, she wasn't wearing a favorite ring and the custom-made pendant she never removed. They didn't turn up in a search of the room. Investigators recovered one of the victim's teeth from the carpet, but could find nothing to link a suspect to the robbery homicide. Stokes and Schaefer had their work cut out for them. Every guest and every employee was a potential witness or a potential suspect. According to Schaefer, everyone had to be questioned.
With the chart of the over 100 hotel employees and over 300 guests, we started in on establishing alibis or whereabouts for each of those individuals.
As detectives began the chore of sending surveys to guests in order to locate potential witnesses, they narrowed the field of potential suspects. The killer could only have struck during the 30 minutes that Bert and June were at breakfast. The door to the room locked automatically, so a person would have to have been let in or would have needed a key to gain entry. Detectives focused on hotel employees who worked that shift and had access to pass keys. They asked each employee to account for his whereabouts during that half hour and to name someone who could vouch for him.
The main object of this investigation at that point became, let's find out who can alibi for who during this time period, and the one person that will not have an alibi will be someone definitely worth looking at.
Investigators knew that it took a sick man to commit a crime this brutal. They were closer to the truth than they ever imagined. Detectives Schaefer and Stokes began to make progress on the Rose Levy homicide investigation as they culled the list of hotel employees. One employee made mention of Elwood Jones, a co-worker who had called in sick with a hand injury. Jones had filed for workers' compensation, saying he'd cut his hand on a metal stairwell on the job. Detectives called him in for an interview. He was one of the only employees who had no alibi during that fatal half hour. They wanted to know more about his injury. They went to Bethesda Oak Hospital, bringing along a court order giving them access to Elwood Jones's records. Jones had checked into the emergency room of the hospital 3 days after the murder with a serious hand injury. The small cut above the knuckle of his left index finger had already sealed up, but an infection festered within.
Oh, well, what's this?
Jones's hand was severely swollen and intensely painful.
Say you did.
He was running a fever.
You did.
Hand surgeon John McDonough was called in to examine the wound.
This was a tremendous blow that he had taken to his hand because it tore the capsule of the joint and inoculated the bacteria directly into the finger joint. It would take a significant amount of pressure to have that occur.
When McDonough asked Jones what happened, he said he'd cut it on a dumpster at work. Not only did that seem unlikely, it also contradicted what he'd told the staff earlier. Jones was left-handed. To McDonough, the position of the wound above the knuckle of the dominant hand indicated that the patient probably was wounded as he punched someone in the mouth. In fact, the injury was so characteristic of a so-called fight bite that McDonough had it photographed to use in his classes. If that were really the cause, McDonough wasn't surprised that his patient lied about it.
People that have human bite injuries try to hide them. try to make light of them, tell you they did something else, like brushing their hand against the wall or cutting it on a dumpster.
The wound, whatever had caused it, called for immediate surgery. McDonough opened and drained it. He reserved some of the fluid so that the infectious bacteria could be cultured and studied. Once it was identified, the proper antibiotic could be prescribed. A human mouth, even a clean one, is home to 42 species of bacteria. Someone with poor dental hygiene can have more. A human bite can be akin to being cut with an object from the bottom of a sewer. At the hospital microbiology lab, the bacteria from Elwood Jones's wound was incubated until the sample grew large enough to be recognizable.
This happens to be a contaminant.
Culturing bacteria can happen overnight or take more than a week. Larry Gray is the director of the lab.
The technologist on the workup bench will look at the plates. They will look at the organisms, the texture, how large they are, the colonies, the size, the color.
The result is then stained, revealing more characteristics of the species when examined under a microscope. Finally, the bacterium is identified and antibiotics are administered.
Jones, how are you feeling
Jones
today?
stayed in the hospital while his infection was being treated.
How's the hand?
After 5 days, he went home.
I'll get a copy of this and put it in his record.
The doctor told the detectives that Jones's hand was infected with Eikenella corrodens. It's a somewhat rare bacterium that thrives on dental plaque below the gum line. To find it inside a man's knuckle required some explaining. McDonough explained it.
When the hand strikes a tooth, the tooth may be broken or the sharp edge inoculates bacteria, and in this case, Eikenella corrodens, deep inside the tissue. I've been doing hand surgery for almost 25 years, and I've only seen 3 cases of Eikenella infection. All 3 of those were associated with a human bite injury.
Detectives felt that Jones could have contracted Eikenella from striking Rose Levy. Now they had what they needed to isolate Jones as the prime suspect. But Jones offered an explanation. He said that after he cut himself on the dumpster, he sucked the wound to clean it. Less than 3/10 of the population has Eikenella bacteria in its saliva, but authorities had to be sure. They swabbed the inside of Jones's mouth and sent the swabs to the lab to be cultured. The results came back. They were negative. The infection was consistent with injuries incurred during the beating death of Rose Levy, and the rarity of the Eikenella infection was enough for detectives to serve a search warrant on the apartment Jones shared with his girlfriend. They confiscated his shoes so they could compare their heel marks with bruises found on the victim. Jones's car was impounded and searched for fiber, blood, or other trace evidence to tie him to the crime. But the most compelling evidence was visible to the naked eye: a hotel passkey. And in a toolbox in the trunk lay the victim's missing pendant. Jones was arrested for the murder of Rose Levy. Prior to his trial, the bruising patterns on the victim were digitally enhanced and the murder weapon was revealed. The marks corresponded with the walkie-talkie that Jones carried on the job. His shoes also matched bruises found on the body. Based on the evidence, investigators put together the events in the hotel room. When Jones saw Bert Stein and June Mays leave for breakfast, he thought the coast was clear for robbery. The suite they shared usually had only 2 occupants. Jones had no reason to believe that September 2nd was any different. He used his passkey to enter. He didn't expect a witness.
Excuse me.
He knew he couldn't afford one. The murder accusation came from the victim's own mouth. On December 11th, 1996, Elwood Jones was convicted of aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, and aggravated murder. Because of the violent nature of the crime, he was sentenced to death. The perfect murder has no witnesses. The perfect killer leaves no trail. But the sheer act of murder disrupts the natural order of things and always leaves traces behind. Science is learning how to read those traces, no matter how insignificant they may first appear to be.